Spiritum tuum et creebuntur.
Et nobis faciem Dei.
Oremus Deus qui corona fidelium Sancti Spiritus solus in covisti. Dona misericordem Spiritu recto sapere et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sed sapientiae
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Right, we were talking about problems in the East. There's never any shortage of that, it seems. So continuing on with that. So backing up a little bit. We're talking about once again the Henoticon, or the Edict of Union, which seems to have caused nothing but disunity amongst Eastern, we'll say, in a broad sense, Eastern Christians, whether they are in Scissor at this time or not. It seems to be sounding off. So those who hold the faith in the East, we can say that, or will profess to at least. The so-called Edict of Union, as we just pointed out, called the exact opposite of that, as Doris puts it, not only carried trouble into the ranks of the faithful, but the very heretics found in it a fruitful source of dissension. The majority of them did not think it clearly enough in their favor. So remember, the big problem with it seems to have been that it did not recognize or did not insist that the Council of Chalcedon must be, in fact, recognized and its definitions adhered to. So they were this Henoticon, this Edict of Union, satisfies nobody, not the Catholics because the Pope did not approve of it, those who were faithful to the Holy See, and not heretics either because it was not, as we just said, it was not sufficiently in their favor, it was not sufficiently clear. Yet that was by design, really. It was designed deliberately to be the way it was, precisely with the idea of being an Edict of Union, but it ended up being a compromise that nobody wanted. That's what the emperor, in fact, produced. And that's what happens when the civil power oversteps its bounds. All kinds of problems arise, and for many reasons, but one of those is simply that this is outside, on the lowest level in some senses, this is just outside of the competence of the civil powers. It's not what they do. They don't know how to deal with these things. Their attempts to fix problems just cause further problems. So it's abstracting from all other problems, such as that's in fact infringement upon the rights of the church, and that's a very serious thing. But even just before getting to such considerations, it's not what they do. It's not what they're good at. The civil power, those who are trained well to hold civil power, have many heavy responsibilities. It's not to put that down in any way, or say that they're ignorant if they have been in fact correctly trained, that they're incompetent. It's just this is not what they do. You wouldn't want a brain surgeon to design a bridge, for example. Even if he's a very good brain surgeon, he's not an engineer. That's a completely different thing. So, by analogy, in this case, even a highly competent emperor is not qualified to deal with matters of faith. He might be interested in matters of faith. He should be. He should have a very keen interest in seeing to it that the faith is properly taught in his realm. But ultimately, it's not for him to make the final decisions in those things. Yes, he is definitely to be involved in that, but in a supporting role to that of the church, not taking over the functions of the church, making decisions in place of, most of all, of the sovereign pontiff. So the state has definitely a place in the preaching of the faith, has an obligation to adhere to and profess the faith just as much as every individual person has an obligation to profess, to adhere to internally and also to externally profess the faith. The state has the state and all of its members after all, the state is made up of human beings. The state has just as much obligation to do that as each individual does. Every individual who makes up a member of the state is obliged to do that as a member of the church. Because ultimately, remember, the purpose of the state and the church are really that of the state is subordinate to that of the church, but is to provide for the welfare of its citizens, whether it be temporal welfare, that's primarily the domain of the state, or the eternal welfare, which is primarily the domain of the church. But the church, obviously, on many occasions and throughout history, has taken many actions to provide for the temporal welfare of many people, and the state has an obligation to provide for to assist in various ways in the preaching of the faith, which pertains more directly to the eternal welfare of the citizens over which it rules. But here, this is an example of overstep, imperial overstep, we might call it in this case, overstep by the emperor, overreaching his bounds. So it is not unworthy of remark that such disorder should have been brought about by a prince who is by no means wanting in uprightness of intention. So that's typically what happens when you have somebody who has good intentions, perhaps, but is dealing with things that are outside his area of competence. Bad things happen. Unintentional consequences ensue when people who don't know what they're doing get into areas for which they're not qualified. So the pages of history teem with narratives of disasters unwittingly brought on by irresolute and wavering characters, and it might well be worthwhile to study the question whether the greatest curse that God in his wrath can hurl down upon a guilty people be not to give them a sovereign who is such but in name. In other words, the way that God punishes nations is by sending them bad rulers. And when that happens, the good suffer along with the evil, because nations can only be punished here and now on this earth, because in eternity, God judges only individual souls, who may or may not have any personal guilt in the sins of their nations. But on earth, nations sin as nations. It's extended family. Now, the entire human race ultimately is nothing more than one huge extended family, all descended from the same first two parents. So it is ultimately one huge extended family. And now every nation can be looked upon as clans, so to speak, within that overarching extended family. And, well, just as sins and vices run in families, we're talking about what we more conventionally call families, run through the members of different family trees, so also sins and vices run amongst different nations. And we say nations, many people like to use the term race, and it does in fact apply. There are different vices that apply to different nations. And those have to be punished somehow. Nations will not go unpunished any more than individuals will ultimately go unpunished. But the only time to punish the nations is on earth. And the good have to suffer along with the evil when that happens. Of course, it may or may not be in punishment for any personal sins of their own, if nothing else. Say, saints living in a nation that's undergoing punishment for its sins, they have opportunity to make up for whatever temporal punishment due to sin they still may have, or to accrue greater merit for heaven. Nobody can ever do too much penance for sin in any case, or to undergo too much for the love of God, obviously. So there is ultimately no injustice done to them, even to saints who might be good people, those good, meaning those who are in the state of grace. The just who live in those nations, no injustice is done to them by having to undergo further, having to bear the punishments of their nation. But those nations have to be punished here and now. And that usually comes in the form of receiving bad rulers, bad in some sense. Whether absolutely outright tyrannical, maybe extremely cruel and violent, or just leeching off of everybody else, or bad in the sense of completely ineffective and very, very weak, which in many ways is worse than somebody who may be a strong ruler who's a tyrant and who abuses his power in various ways, but still basically provides for the good of the state. I mean, in a way, that's a lesser evil than a ruler who's absolutely ineffective, does nothing, maybe does no harm to his nation, but doesn't prevent other nations from preying off of it, for example. That could be worse. It depends on the scenario, but in many ways that could be worse. So, indeed, many times bad rulers are at least the occasion for the punishment of nations. Many times they can be both the source of both the sins and the punishments of the sins of the nation. Can't work out that way. Okay, so St. Felix III was not insensible to the complaints which daily reached him from all the Catholics in the East, victims of Acacius tyranny. In 485 AD, another council was called at Rome once more to discuss this sad situation. Let's say a question. The anathemas already pronounced against Peter Mungus, Peter the Fuller, and Acacius were renewed. A synodal letter to all the Orthodox, notice again lowercase, meaning those who hold the faith and are in communion with the Holy See. A synodal letter to all the Orthodox priests and abbots of Constantinople and Bithynia informed the East of the sentence pronounced against these relapsed heretics. In the preceding year, the partisans of Acacius had tried to take exception to the validity of his deposition on the ground that the act was signed by the Pope alone. That's actually the strongest proof of it. If you have such a decree, such a statement signed by the Pope himself only, that means that came directly from him. And that's it. There is no appeal from that to anything else whatsoever. Don't even try. So that means if SSPX, if they say that Paul VI was a true pope, then they are shut down. Absolutely, no question about it whatsoever. Because Archbishop Lefebvre received a letter from Paul VI written in Paul VI's own hand, which popes never do, write individual letters saying, I shut you down, but that's precisely what he got. A letter saying everything that came, everything about the suppression of your society, Paul VI said, came from me. So there's no question of, even if it did not come directly from, obviously Paul VI was not a real pope, but in the case of a real pope shutting something down, even if it's someone below him who shuts down any given society, but with his approval, that's the end of story. Cannot protest that it was done invalidly because it wasn't according to some particular legal form or something like that. That holds no water. We can get into that in a bit, but in the case of SSPX, if they say he's the real pope, then they were shut down. It was only founded as a pious union anyway. It's never a society of common life without vows. Never ever. Abstracting from all canonical considerations of whether that exists or not, just completely leaving all that aside, it was never founded as that, and Paul VI completely shut it down anyway. So, according to their own standards, they should just disband. But they do whatever they very well please, so they'll never do that. But also keep in mind that this idea of appealing, of citing laws to a superior, obviously, yes, a tyrant might set aside laws that he himself has passed, but keep in mind that ultimately this separation of legislative, judicial, executive powers, that's practically a dogma of liberal Western government, is really absurd because it's all the same power. The power to make laws, the power to apply those laws, to how those laws apply to punishing those who offend them and to carrying them out. All of that, it's all one and the same power. When you consider it's absurd that one person should pass a law, another should interpret it and decide what it really means. The one who passed it is the one who knows what it means and knows and is the one to apply it. It's all the same thing. But this idea of checks and balances is an absurdity. The idea of the purpose of government is not to be a source of friction, but to govern. Government should be efficient, not deliberately inefficient. But it's all born of these Enlightenment ideas that people are generally good. Remember, keep in mind, it's all founded on a denial of original sin and its effects. But the idea that, maybe that'd be some people who are bad, but people generally are good, inclined to good. And so if you have just pack the system with as many people as possible who are all meant to keep one another in check, then everything will turn out fine. All the bad people will be prevented from carrying out their agenda. That's the theory. But that theory is based on falsehoods. So the theory ends up as a disaster in practice, which we hardly need to illustrate that other than just pointing to headlines every day. Just how inefficient and how full of corruption it all has become. Because, in fact, people are not inclined to good. Due to original sin and its effects, people are inclined to exactly the opposite, inclined to evil. So the point of all that being that this notion that you can that you can cite a law to a superior who is applying that law and say, no, this is actually what it really means. He's the one who passes it and applies it and decides what it actually means, is the authentic interpreter of it. Not to say that subjects have no rights, but the point is you can't dictate to a superior what he is supposed to be doing. If he goes against what he promises to do, he might in that case be a tyrant, but he is in fact the one who is in charge of all of that. So could elaborate on that for a long time, but in any case, there is no appeal. The point is that in the application of all that to this situation, that there is no appeal from a decision of the Pope. So what they say is, it's only the Pope signed it. Well, that's end of story. That's proof positive that this is valid, this sentence of deposition. The words deserve to be quoted whenever the pontiffs of the Lord, so pontifex, keep in mind in Latin, can refer to a bishop. Pontifex. That refers to, a position of a priest. In pagan Rome, pontifex, bridge builder, was a title of a priest. And pontifex, that now summus pontifex, refers to the Pope, but it could also refer to bishops. You see that very often in rubrics, works of rubricists or the rubrics of the Roman Pontifical. You might see it pontifex, meaning the bishop. You might see episcopus, but you also find pontifex. In fact, a solemn mass offered by a bishop, celebrated by a bishop, is called a pontifical mass. He's doing it with solemnity that is his as, in some sense, a pontiff. So in this context, we're talking about bishops. Whenever the pontiffs of the Lord meet together in Italy to treat the cause, of course, in this instance, he's also referring to one in which the supreme pontiff is at the head of it. Whenever the pontiffs of the Lord meet together in Italy to treat the cause and interests of the church, it is a rule that the successor of St. Peter in the Apostolic See, in the name of all the pontiffs of Italy, decide and pronounce without appeal, since he is charged with the care of all the churches. So there is, without appeal, there is no appeal from his decision. He is their head. To him our Lord has said in the person of the Prince of the Apostles, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Obedient to these words, 318 fathers of Nice acknowledge the right of the Church to confirm and exercise jurisdiction over all the others. Through the grace of Jesus Christ, the succession of our pontiffs has kept these two prerogatives down to our own time. In the present case, the judgment pronounced upon Acacius by the council at St. Peter's was confirmed by the Holy Father Felix, our head, who communicated it to the East through Tutus, defender of the Church. Remember, who did not defend the Church very well. He gave way to pressure by the emperor, but he was in fact one who communicated that. Felix added to the council's dispatch a long and eloquent rescript addressed to the faithful of the East, reviewing the whole series of sad events which had darkened the last 10 years of the Church of Constantinople. He refuted all the arguments brought forward in defense of Acacius's conduct. His condemnation was plainly proved to be regular, so Acacius' condemnation was plainly proved to be regular and canonical, and the Pope demanded that the lawful sentence should be immediately put into execution. These energetic measures, proceeding from the center of unity, hardly found entrance into the East. So notice this pattern being established. Continued rejection of the authority of the Roman pontiff, the supreme pontiff in the East. Disregarding him in various ways, protesting against his actions, etc. Zeno, still bound by the wiles of Acacius, who's really turned into a wolf by now, you can see clearly, had forbidden all communication between Rome and his states. So, patterns being established, keep all this in mind. Yet in spite of the strict watch he kept upon his boundaries, especially at the Dardanelles, justice and truth, ever slow but equally sure in their progress, were breaking upon the universal mind. So the Dardanelles, the straits, remember, south and west of Constantinople, along the approach to Constantinople. The very violence of the triumphant Eutychians, their persecutions of the Monophysites, in other words, their persecutions, injustice and cruelty towards the Catholics, stirred up a feeling of contempt and indignation in every honest heart. Such was the outcry against the intruder Peter the Fuller in the See of Antioch that Apicius himself, who had been chiefly instrumental in bringing about the usurpation, was forced to break off all open relations with him. Still, this did not hinder Peter from expelling, according to the impulse of his madness, the Catholic bishops of the province of Antioch, and from giving their sees to the most unworthy subjects. Thus he conferred episcopal consecration upon a Persian slave, driven from his own country on account of his crimes, and who had never even been baptized. So that's actually invalid. An invalid episcopal consecration. Because he who is, we'll get to this in a second, but that is a valid baptism. Actually, valid baptism is required for valid priestly ordination, and for a valid episcopal consecration, a valid priestly ordination is in the first place required. The bishop thus unlawfully set up by an intruded patriarch was called Zanias. He was placed in the see of Hierapolis after the expulsion of Cyrus, the rightful prelate. When Peter the Fuller was blamed for a consecration so contrary to the first elements of the plainest theology, he answered, "The grace of the episcopate supplies the want of the baptismal," which is false. That's all there is to say about that. Not true. You need the character of baptism, the sacrament, that the sacrament of baptism, Prince of the soul, must be present. Again, for priestly ordination, for that character to be imprinted, and then that has to already be validly imprinted before it can, in a sense, mature into that of the episcopacy. So it seems that certainly we can say that the first time that the sacrament of holy orders confers, the first participation in it, we might say, that is received, definitely of divine institution, which definitely confers the character, is the diaconate. That is definitely a divine institution. There's debate as to whether the subdiaconate is of divine institution or not. It seems, especially since the definition of Pius XII is laying down exactly the essential matter and form for holy orders, it seems that the subdiaconate is of ecclesiastical institution. He did not touch upon that directly, but his definition lends credence to that position because he said very clearly that the essential matter and form for holy orders are the imposition of hands, in the case of diaconate, one hand, and the essential form indicating the grace of the Holy Ghost being conferred, and the order also being conferred. And in the subdiaconate, you don't have an imposition of hands. Hit one hand or two hands, it's essentially the same, and there's no essential form that does exactly that. It has more, in other words, the subdiaconate has more in common with the minor orders than it does with the diaconate, priesthood, and episcopacy. And actually, at one time, the subdiaconate was considered to be a minor order. So it seems that it was probably, all of that lends to the notion, definitely adds weight to the notion that the subdiaconate is of ecclesiastical institution. So it seems. Again, that's not in any way to put down the subdiaconate. That is a tremendous step, obviously, to receive the subdiaconate. That is the point of no return. It carries with it, its reception carries with it the grave obligation to observe celibacy for the rest of your life, and also to say the office every day for the rest of your life. So that's not in any way to put it down, but it just seems it was highly likely is of ecclesiastical institution. So, but that's another thing, really. It's another question. So no further evidence was needed of the ignorance of the wretched heretic. So Zanias was not more learned. So, in other words, cucarachas are not a new thing. About extremely ignorant people trying to take up positions of very high dignity and also actually of very high peril, very great peril. That's not a new thing. To receive holy orders is to put oneself in a very dangerous position. The number of the dangers, the perils that beset those who receive orders are very high. Coming from many directions. The devil, for one thing, obviously attacks those who receive holy orders through various ways, maybe differently from the way in which he might attack laymen, but definitely the clergy are subject to attacks by the devil from various different ways. That the devil can tempt or attack anybody in various ways. Any person, any soul on earth whom God allows to be so tested, the devil can attack, molest in some way. And it's a position of peril because of that. being a special target of the devil, and also the obligations of the priesthood are many and heavy, and there are many things to be observed in the carrying out of those functions that are bind under sub gravi. Many things that must be observed under pain of grave sin in all those functions. So Zanias spent the whole time of his usurped episcopacy in overturning the statues of the saints, which he called idolatrous images. So here you have iconoclasm. That's a heresy we'll see later on. This notion that all images of anything sacred are all evil. That's idolatry. To forge or to venerate in any way images of a divine person, any saint, or Our Lady, whatever the instance might be, that's all necessarily idolatrous, which is a heresy. So it's called iconoclasm, meaning referring to the practice of going around destroying sacred images. So we see here our early iconoclast. It will become a much more widespread problem later on. But here we see the beginnings of it. He thus made himself a worthy forerunner of the stupid ferocity of the iconoclasts. And there was indeed a stupid ferocity, both stupid and ferocious. So Egypt was no better off under the despotic rule of Peter Mongus. By the help of a few Eutychian Monophysite bishops and abbots, Peter held a kind of permanent cabal. So he had a clique of people who were his strongmen, so to speak. Every day he renewed his anathemas against the Council of Chalcedon in the august memory of St. Leo the Great. So also, forerunners, indications, foreshadowings of various other absurdities to come from the Eastern schismatics, such as their attempts to excommunicate the Pope. They would try that later on. So those later schismatics really doing nothing, not particularly original or imaginative. Not that these people are very bright lights or anything, but they're doing nothing really unheard of, the later ones. These absurd things that come from clearly dumb people from earlier times. So every cleric and monk who did not receive the writings of Dioscurus and Timothy Aelurus was sent into exile. This persecution was carried to such a pitch that the archimandrite Nephalius resolved to undertake the journey to Constantinople to lay the complaint of the desolate church at the feet of the emperor. But, well, given what Zeno's track record by this point, that's not a great deal. Hopefully he didn't do that with a great deal of optimism, because he would have been sorely disappointed. Zeno had restored Peter Mongus with the sole view of quieting Alexandria. It was so you see the emperor, he just wants peace. You see that we saw it earlier with Emperor Constantine. Started falling short at the service of the church because he just wanted peace in his empire, which is an understandable motive, but that motive has to be pursued by the correct means. You'll never have peace in your empire if you put heretics in positions of positions of power in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. That's the surest way to continue fomenting problems, as we're seeing right now. It was visible to him that the men of his choice were not more fit than his decrees to carry out his purpose. So the emperor, hopefully he has some sincerity. Hopefully he has more sincerity than the people he's putting in these positions. And if he is, he will start turning around, to start mending his ways somewhat at least. He positively ordered the patriarch, supposed patriarch anyway, to cease his persecution and to recall the monks he had banished. The three apostates, Acacius, Peter the Fuller, and Peter Mongus, occupying respectively the sees of, illegitimately, but occupying the sees of Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, respectively, making free use of all the influence they possessed at court, leagued in the same views of independence of the Holy See, and in the same attachment for heresy, must have looked upon their triumph as certain, and deemed Eutychianism forever rooted in the East. But God was about to put to confusion their proud conceits and ambitious projects. Peter the Fuller was stricken down, first in 488 AD, and the next year, 489, Acacius followed him to the grave, and the year 490 brought the final summons also to Peter Mongus, the usurper of Alexandria, the hoary persecutor, who disgraced the throne of Cyril and an Athanasius. So St. Cyril of Alexandria, and also St. Athanasius, very famously patriarch of Alexandria, also were his legitimate occupiers of that see before him. Of course, you take probably at least two hands to count the number of times St. Athanasius was banished from his see by various troublemaking heretics and emperors and whoever else may have thought it fun to act up at that time. So imagine that. That's quite a powerful statement of divine justice. 1 year, 3 years in a row, these three arch troublemakers all being called to eternity. So that's to anybody with a conscience, that would have been a wake-up call. Peter the Fuller and Peter Bongus were succeeded by heretics, though, unfortunately. But after the short reign of Fravitas, who held the patriarchal throne but a few months, the see of Constantinople was filled by a pious and holy priest named Euphemius. As his orthodoxy had been proved, St. Felix admitted him to Catholic communion, but refused him episcopal communion because Euphemius, out of regard for Zeno, refused to efface the name of Acacius from the sacred diptychs. Notice the importance attached to that. The diptychs. The record, the place of where the names of those to be proclaimed as being in communion were written for purposes of being pronounced during the course of the sacred liturgy. Notice the importance attached to that. So he admits him to Catholic communion, but not Episcopal communion. So to membership in the church, but not to being actually not confirming him as a bishop. Which is, remember, necessary for everybody, any bishop to be legitimate, to be confirmed by the Roman pontiff. And it also says certain proclamations and certain teachings of Pius XII, which it seems were not meant to be definitions, but since certain teachings of Pius XII, it seems that every single bishop receives his jurisdiction through the Roman pontiff. He's more than an agent of the Pope in his see. There are such things as papal agents, so to speak. That's not the title they're given the title of apostolic vicars, but which means a representative of the Pope in a particular area. Which there might be various number of reasons why anybody might be appointed to that position and then sent to a particular territory to take care of it. But the point here is that a bishop of a diocese is more than that. He's more than simply it's still a position of very great dignity, but he's more than a representative or an agent of the Pope. He is a he's a true pastor of the diocese. But still, he receives the jurisdiction as such, as pastor of his diocese through the Pope. So the conduct of St. Felix on this occasion in granting the first and refusing the second communion to Euphemius clearly shows the distinction between the two, the first regarding faith granted to all the faithful, the second, the episcopal communion, properly so called, and solicited from the Holy See by bishops elect as a necessary confirmation of their election. So in other words, there's a much higher standard to be applied to really the clergy in general, but most of all to the bishops, who have very high positions of very great dignity in ruling the church. That's a different set of rules, a different standard to be applied to those who are made bishops than to those who are simply members of the lay faithful. Somebody might fall into very grave sins, but once he is has done penance for his sin, has made it clear that he is rejected, that he is repentant for his past evil ways, and that he is now contrite. Once he has done penance for his sin, has distanced himself from them, so that there's no danger of scandal, he may be readmitted to the communion of the faithful. But it's an entirely different thing to be then raised to the exalted position of a bishop in the hierarchy of the church, especially a diocesan bishop. Because there are, keep in mind, such things as titular bishops, which is that's what they're called now. Titular bishops. It was something maybe to explain another time, but essentially a way of making someone a bishop by power of orders without actually giving him a diocese to rule over. So, that's an explanation for another time, but there you have it. Okay, so the conduct. Okay, so the death of Acacius and the election of his two successors had naturally reopened negotiations between the Holy See and the court of Constantinople. The sovereign pontiff seized the occasion to make a last effort and to recall Zeno again to Catholic sentiments and conduct. The Pope's letter is the outpouring of a most sincerely affectionate heart. It is with abundant tears that I write these lines, prostrate at the feet of your piety. How could I find any trouble in humbling myself before the powers of the empire, when the apostle says of himself that he made himself the outcast and reproach of all men? So he's saying, I am assuming the position of a suppliant here and asking you to behave yourself and do what you know to be your duty as someone who professes to be a Christian emperor. I entreat you not to reject my paternal entreaties, not to despise my words, for as unworthy as I am, it is the apostle St. Peter who entreats you by my voice, and through him our Lord Jesus Christ himself, who does not wish to see his church torn to pieces. So even notice what he does here. The old and the new Rome. He even uses the title of New Rome to refer to Constantinople. Must be united in one faith, the faith which, according to St. Paul, is preached throughout the world, so that the two cities may have but one faith, as they bear the same name. So, the Pope calls Constantinople, we have in the footnote there, the new Rome, as it had in fact succeeded to the imperial power of the old. But notice that it's only in that sense can it be called the second Rome. It is not the second Rome in the sense of having divinely granted prerogatives next to that only of the Holy See itself. That is not true. It is the Holy See, the See of St. Peter, that must continue to the end of the world, and whose rulers, whose pastors, the sovereign pontiffs, have exactly that, the special dignity, that of the Pope. All the rest, the hierarchy of, yes, there is definitely a hierarchy amongst the other sees of the church, but that is 100% at the discretion, by divine ordinance, that is 100% at the discretion of the pastor of the See of Rome, who is the Vicar of Christ on earth. 100%. That is, of course, our Lord could have granted any prerogatives to any other see that he wanted, but he did not. He left that to the discretion of the Roman pontiff. And in this case, it's for the purpose of getting the emperor to behave himself that the Pope is making the concession of referring to Constantinople in a purely political sense as being the second Rome. Because in a political sense it is. Or was, at least. But not in any greater sense than that. My entreaties will ever continue to present themselves before your throne as long as the traces of these fatal divisions last. A tender, dignified, and lofty tone of these words shows the heart that bears the charge of all the churches. And you would, of course, not expect any less from a pontiff who is now canonized. You must notice here also, though, the title of son given by the Pope to Zeno. So most definitely, the emperor is, as a member of the church, really a layman. As a member of the church, he is in a lower position than, in certain ways, we can say certainly, than a simple priest, than the most simple parish priest who takes care of simple souls in a country parish church. An emperor is less than that. The dignity of the priesthood, even possessed even by the lowest, humblest priest, is greater than that of emperors. It's greater than that of the angels, in fact. So this is this instance of the Pope addressing the emperor as son, is the first instance of this that we find in history of a form since consecrated by custom. So notice that we cite many encyclicals in spiritual conferences. Notice in all those instances the Pope addresses the bishops as his brethren. Of course, they are still below him in the hierarchy of the church. Obviously, they're not his equals. That's no Vatican II nonsense of collegiality going on here. The Pope only has dignity as the head of the college of bishops. I'm not talking about that. We're saying that they are more worthy, bishops are more worthy of the title of brethren to be given that title by the Roman pontiff than an emperor is. Emperors are addressed as sons, the children of the Pope, rather than brethren in any sense. So the superscription was thus worded: Gloriosissimo et Serenissimo Filio Zenoni Augusto, Felix Episcopus in Domino Salutem. So to the most glorious and serene son, Zeno Augustus, and to him, Felix, bishop, meaning, of course, Bishop of Rome, the sovereign pontiff, wishes salvation in our Lord. So Zenos was not a mind to understand the mission of a Christian emperor and the immense authority which would accrue to kings and princes from a concord of the spiritual and temporal powers. Which is something that many civil rulers throughout history have either failed to recognize or just didn't care about. That their best subjects, whether they themselves, the rulers, are faithful members of the church or not, still their best subjects, as long as they, the rulers, are legitimate, their best subjects are faithful Catholics, who understand that by virtue of obedience, they owe obedience to any legitimate civil ruler, whatever his personal vices might be, whether he is a member of the church or not. They still recognize in that civil ruler authority invested by God himself as the author of nature. But Zeno's mind is, well, as is sadly the case for too many people, is not seeing these distinctions. Distinctions are supremely important. So many things are answered by distinctions. Sometimes people get all hung up and all confused and all troubled about something, some question. They meet some objection. They cannot figure out the answer to it, and then so they bring it up, trying somehow to find the answer to this, and then it's some very simple distinction. They're just not aware of the importance of making distinctions. In many cases, many times, it just boils down to that. You guys have to be taught how to make distinctions. So Zeno's last years were given up to infamous pleasures and ceaseless orgies, the details of which Dara spares us, mercifully. Inebriety and voluptuousness had made him cruel. His scepter had fallen into the hands of his eunuchs, who now ruled in his name, and the evils which wrung tears from the eyes of Jeremias were now renewed in the east. So, eunuch is originally a title given to somebody who is entrusted in the royal house, in the house of the emperor. And throughout time, that title, that position remained. So eunuchs of the emperors are people of very high authority, very high. So originally, they were servants in the emperor's house who became entrusted more and more, and so they came to have, in fact, very great power in the empire. And so this is also something that's a very common pattern, that drunkenness and voluptuousness make someone cruel, because, well, that's ultimately such things, drunkenness and sins of impurity, have their basis in selfishness. That person seeking his own pleasure. So he becomes, the only thing he can focus on is his own pleasure. And maybe it's his pleasure, maybe someone is standing in the way of his pleasure, he'll kill that person. Or maybe it's his pleasure to cause that person pain, he will do that. So, the point is, concupiscence leads to cruelty, very quickly and easily. That's a common pattern. Henry VIII, look at Henry VIII, for example. So, obviously, given over to sins of impurity, how many wives he had, and that's publicly known on the historical record, just how given over he was to sins of impurity. And also, it's obvious just how given he was to cruelty. And he was also immensely fat, or became fat anyway. So you can see, concupiscence and cruelty go hand in hand, because it's all selfishness. So this is also a very common pattern, a ruler falling into just that kind of thing, falling into all kinds of sins of concupiscence. And as typically happens for anybody who falls into such sins, the intellect is dulled. Because after a while, the only thing that such a person can think about is his own pleasure. Stops thinking or even caring about anything else. That's why, I would say, the entertainment industry produces so much filth. It's a way of controlling people, getting them addicted to sins of impurity, impure pleasure. After a while, that's all they can think about. They'll do whatever they're told. They'll go wherever they're led. Whether or not it makes any sense at all to anybody who has two neurons that have any kind of electrical spark between them. Because after a while, even that is doused by their desire and relentless pursuit of pleasure. Everything else just falls by the wayside in favor of that pursuit of pleasure. And so in the case of rulers, that means they have just completely neglect and abandoning entirely their duties as rulers and give that over to other people. And things might improve when that happens or might not, but in this case, not. So the evils which were wrung from the tears of Jeremiah were now renewed in the east. The words of Holy Writ, meaning sacred scripture, were verified in them now. Servi dominati sunt nostri. So that's from the Lamentations of Jeremiah. So the death of Zeno, which occurred in 491 AD, was naturally looked upon as a release. So, yeah, this is one of the advantages, in fact, of a strongly monarchical system, in which you have one man at the top who rules everything. He might be terrible, but he will die eventually. And he might die suddenly, you never know. And somebody better might come along. Maybe not, but there's always that chance. Whereas you look at what we have now, what St. Thomas would call the tyranny of many, and that's not going anywhere, unfortunately. Not easily, at any rate. So it takes a great deal more for that to go away than for one bad monarch. A monarch in the person of one man to go away. So the modern Greeks have surrounded his death with the most shocking details. So this isn't really all that important, but they pretend that his wife buried him alive during a lethargy caused by intoxication. So that, whether that or not is the case, still that's a foretaste of all kinds of other things to come in the East. All kinds of other terrible types of behavior to come in the East. This account has not been adopted by reliable historians, perhaps not, but such a thing should happen in Constantinople is not outside the realm of possibility, to say the least. So more on that later, perhaps. However this may be, the memory of Zeno will ever remain charged with all the dissensions, strifes, and persecutions which distracted the church during his reign, and which he could so easily have checked by a simple and true submission to the Orthodox, meaning of course the Catholic faith, with all the Catholics. While the East was torn by hostile factions under the influence of Eutychianism, the deserts about Jerusalem bloomed with the most. This is Daras's poetic prose for you here. His poetic way of describing things. The deserts about Jerusalem bloomed with the most charming virtues of solitude. So the point is that, remember, every time, at every period in the history of the church, in which we look at all the problems, because that's mainly what we look at, are the problems in the history of the church, that for every story of trouble that there are, in fact, many devout Catholics living normally, at least as normally as possible, in whatever situation there might be, whatever might obtain. That there are always, of course, saints at every time, at every period in the history of the church. Whether we know about those saints or not, they're there. The canonized saints of which we know, of course, are only some of the saints. We have that reminded of that every single day at the end of the martyrology, that there are many. We hear all the saints we know about, but there are many, many others in many places. Many saints of every kind. Fall into all the different categories of saints that we honor throughout the year in the church. That the church honors every single year. We know all of them, but there are many others who are known only to God. You may know that story of someone must have been a Franciscan friar was praying at the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi. He was praying at his grave, and he had a vision of an angel who was kneeling at near the tomb next to that, incensing it. That friar, nobody even knew who he was. And the friar who was praying there asked, "Who is this? Why is the angel incensing this tomb instead of that of St. Francis?" And he said, "Well, this friar, just by living in obscurity and following the rule of his order, reached a degree of sanctity that was, if not his great thing, greater than that of St. Francis." And this was somebody nobody even knew. His identity is lost to history. During his life, may have never been noticed for being conspicuous in any way. But now is, and of course, honored in heaven, at least as greatly, if not more than, so that seems to suggest even more than St. Francis of Assisi himself, whose life is, of course, well known. The details of his life you can read a great deal about. And he was very famous in the church. So, St. Sabas, whose earliest infancy had been prevented, so in other words, had been met very early on by the graces of the Holy Ghost, had entered a monastery near Caesarea, Cappadocia, at the age of 8 years. His progress in religious humility, patience, gentleness, and obedience corresponded with his early promise. So, in other words, he's an abbot who lived in the desert. So I have to go through the details of his life here. But this is just one example of. Keep in mind, there are good things happening, despite all the problems. There are, in fact, good things that are happening. Okay, we'll continue with problems again next time. Et Filii et Spiritus Sancti men subtuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras deprecationes et specias in necessitatibus sed a periclis contis libera nos semper virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.